when new ideas in science came up, he was suspicious and he said, well, you know what? I was very successful before, not just a little successful. I was Einstein. If I believe that these new ideas are wrong, they must be wrong.
Today I'm here with David Bodanis. Who are you, Mr. David Bodanis?
It's a great question. A while ago, I was flying to a conference in Finland. I live in England, and I was flying with my son, who was then 11 years old. And you had to fill out a landing form, and it said, "What's your name? What's your son's name? And what nationality? And your profession?" And I remember when I fit in writer, and I gave my son's name Sam. I'm Jewish, and in the Jewish families, you only name a child after a parent who is dead. You don't name it after a living person. So if I had seen that when I was a little child myself, I would have realized several things: that I would grow up and become a writer, that I would have a son, that my father would have died, that I'd be able to name him after him. And I just thought, from that little piece of paper, what a life I've come up with. I've managed to have children. I've spent the last many decades just writing books. And it's been much easier than I thought it would be.
So I don't understand. So I still don't understand who you are. But what I understood so far is that you are a writer.
That's it.
And you have children. Is that correct? And you are from a Jewish family.
Yes, I suppose those are the most important things. My wife is Anglican. I grew up in Chicago, and I now live in England. I lived in France for much of my 20s. Then I lived in England for the last few decades. I still speak with a Chicago accent. My kids speak British, and my wife is very English, very Anglican. She's so English that when she travels, she takes tea bags with her wherever she goes, because you need English tea everywhere in the world. I'm proud of that.
Okay, so first topic that I want to talk about is Einstein. So who is Einstein, and why you spend a lot of your life writing about him?
Sure. So in short,
how you started researching Einstein, because he's dead. You don't know him probably, right?
Correct. Yeah. So when I was a little boy growing up in Chicago in the 1950s and the 1960s, a lot of families had a photograph of Einstein that they would tape up and put on their refrigerator, or they put up on the wall. And I think we were proud. It was an ordinary, not wealthy neighborhood. Many of the people there, it was all Jewish. Many people had survived World War II. They were proud to be in America and be in a safe place. And almost nobody was trained in science. So we didn't really know what Einstein had done, but we knew he was considered a great man. He was considered a great thinker. And also, we knew that everybody respected him. And it was really nice. If you're from a minority that you think people had attacked and picked on you and stuff, and to find out that somebody from your people was a great man, it's great. Sort of like a lot of people in South Africa. They'd have pictures of Nelson Mandela up. And so even if people insult us and are racist to us, we know we can produce somebody great. So that was always in the back of my head.
So, and then when Einstein was Jewish, right?
Yes. Yeah. And then when I went to university, I found out what he had done. I found out his work in science, and I began to understand what he had done in physics. So I thought, oh, that was really interesting. So then as I got older, I put that to aside, and I wrote other books. I wrote books on history and some books on popular science. And then when I reached, I stopped writing when I can't remember when, maybe in my late 30s or so. I was living in London. I had a nice life. I had little kids then. And my books, the sales were beginning to go down. So I thought, that's okay. I've been a writer for 10, 15 years. It's good to have different careers, to change. So I began to work with the Shell Oil Company in their long-term planning unit. And I thought that was fine. It's good life. Maybe I'll do that for 10 years. But then I was walking down the street in London one day, and I got a great idea. And I thought, everybody has heard of the equation E equals mc squared. Even people who have no interest in science whatsoever. We all have heard of E equals mc squared, but nobody knows what it means. What is this? What is this thing? And I realized I could explain it because I know what it means. And then I spent about a year thinking about it. It's often very useful if you get an idea for a project to not start it right away. I was still working at Shell Oil. I had to work on these long-term planning.
S-
Go ahead.
Sleep on it. This is what they say.
Yes, yes, sleep on it. And in this case, it was the exact same thing. So for several months, I thought about it, but only in the back of my head. And then when I finally was able to put aside the my day job, my main work, and I started, I was ready to come at it in a fresh way. And I began to write it as a mystery story, like Sherlock Holmes, a detective story. There's the letter E in the equation. Where does it come from? Who created the letter E? What does it mean? There's a funny little symbol C in the equation. What does that mean? Where does it come from? And I found it came from really interesting people. It allowed me to go into French history and German history, and instead of just being like a science book, which could be a little bit boring, you began to read about all these interesting people. And by learning about the parents and the grandparents of E equals MC squared, along the way, you were getting fun personal stories, and the mystery was slowly solved. At one point, I said to the reader in the book, you might ask, when are you going to begin to learn about relativity and what it means? And I said, you've been doing it for the last 50 pages, but in a very gentle way.
Okay, so you started writing about Einstein because it was a role model of the world and because you wanted to make money, as I
Yes,
understand.
money is very important. Um, so what I found is curious. When you're writing a book, if you try to only make money, if you say, you know what, I don't really care about a police adventure story, but that makes money. So I'm going to try to write one. It's usually not very good. Your heart isn't in it. And I found the books that I actually care about, that I have an emotional feeling for, those are actually likely to be the ones that are most successful. Because there was another thing about Einstein. Yes, I was happy to explain his equation, but also, I think, as I mentioned, my own father passed away when I was 10 years old. He died when I was young. And I always wondered, uh, what was he like? And what are the forces in the universe, things that we can't see? What exists and survives around us? What's the basis of the universe? Um, and so I really wanted to. It's not that I didn't identify Einstein with my father. I knew they were very different people, but I just wanted to understand somebody who could be like a father for everybody, who could understand and be a wise man explaining things. And that was my desire in my heart. And I think that's what one of the things that came off in the book. So, as you politely said, the book became very, very successful. I translated, I think, into 24 languages or 25 languages. A sign of success is you forget how many languages it was translated into. You know, if it's only one, you remember. Um, but I was happy with that. And people, they even now, it keeps on selling. People write to me and they were touched. Yes, they learned the science. That's interesting. But they felt a connection with Einstein. And I liked that so much that I wrote other books. And then about 10 years later, or 15 years later, I wrote another book about Einstein. So the first one was about his success. And I thought, the other book I wrote, the next one about Einstein, Einstein's greatest mistake, about his failures.
And who doesn't like to learn about the failures?
Exactly. You can think, I'm smarter than Einstein. I did not make that failure. You know, like when little boys watch football players, they look at somebody and say, oh, he's such an idiot. He was terrible. The other player went right by him. Now, the player who was such an idiot, if it's in the Premier League in Britain, is a very good player. Or if it's in the World Cup, they're very good players. But if you see them make a mistake, you can feel superior. Ha, I wouldn't make that mistake.
Yes, and it kind of humanized them as well. That
Yes.
they
Yes, it
th-
humanizes them.
and one thing that it's kind of big thing when from your heroes you understand that they are vulnerable. Is like something inside you that it tells you that you can do similar stuff as well.
Yes, it's not magical. That's sometimes the problem if you, when you're little or beginning your career, if you speak to people who are older who might be successful, you think, well, it's easy for them. Look, my friend created a podcast, or my other friend became a writer. And they don't know of all the difficult steps along the way, the things that went wrong. It can be too intimidating. It can be seem too easy. And if they find out that it's difficult, here's an example. I once saw a lecture by a famous artist, David Macaulay, who did these big illustrated books that were very successful. And what was interesting is he gave a lecture showing all the attempts he made that were unsuccessful. The times he tried to draw a story and it wasn't very interesting. And he would show us that. And then he would show, okay, he tried it a different way. Still didn't work. And that was just like what you said. It was very relaxing. We thought, okay, he's not a perfect God. He's a person. He's very good, but he's a person. He works at it.
Okay, so we're going to start learning about what made Einstein different as a person. Then we're going to jump into the part about his failures, his greatest failures. And then we're going to jump into how much money you made by reading books. But let's see. So, what made Einstein special? You think? What was different, interesting about you, and different about him?
Yeah, there were. I suppose there were two things that really made him special. One is that he lived in many different countries. So by the time his first big idea, E equals MC squared, and the ideas associated with that came when he was about 25 or 26 years old. And there were many scientists in Europe who were working on similar ideas, but he was better than them. And those scientists were very intelligent. If you gave them IQ tests, they would all be, very high, excellent students. But many of them had only lived in one country. They only had one sort of teacher. Einstein, as I mentioned, Einstein was Jewish, and his father was an electrical contractor, installed light bulb and electrical systems for cities. And they lived in Germany. And in Germany in the 1890s, it wasn't like later. It wasn't terribly anti-Jewish, but it was just a little bit. So his father kept on not getting contracts. He would put in a contract to do the light bulbs in Munich for the city, and he had a really good electrical engineering company and good engineers. And they would say, "Look, I'm sorry, we're going to give it to somebody else." So he realized it wasn't going to work. So when Einstein was about 15 or 16, his family moved. They moved all the way to Italy. They crossed the Alps and they moved to Italy. Today, a lot of people live in different countries. You can fly. It's easy. In the
No,
1890s,
I disagree. No,
oh,
especially United States people never travel abroad. Most of them.
you're right. Even today, you're right. Even today. But at that time, it was a big thing. So he was left behind in Germany. And then when he was 16, he dropped out of high school and traveled by himself to Italy. And then he wanted to go to a university, but he didn't really have a good high school qualification. And there was a place in Switzerland that would take you in, a university in Zurich called ETH. It's still around today, a technical engineering university. Well, now it's science and stuff. And so he moved to Switzerland to do the training. So by the time he was 26, he'd lived in Germany, he'd lived in Italy, he'd lived in Switzerland. He saw different approaches. He was ready to try fresh approaches rather than just one approach, and that helped a lot. He also he needed to get money. He wasn't a terrible student. He was an okay student, but he couldn't get a job as a researcher in science, so he got a job working in the patent office, which is kind of interesting. You see lots of fresh ideas. You have to learn how to see the essence of them very quickly. Imagine you lived in Silicon Valley today and people came in with a new idea for software like this, a new type of artificial intelligence like that. It's very interesting. You learn how to not do the details, but see the overall patterns. So in the 1890s and 1900, when he began to work, he worked at a patent office in Zurich, and that was interesting. They had new ideas about electrical engineering, and he got good
So,
at seeing things.
so you think living in the edge of technology and understanding what is happening is a feature? for his life.
Yes, so that helped very much. So sometimes people who come up with good ideas in technology, they they didn't grow up in a family of electrical engineers. Maybe they grew up somewhere very different, and they can come in with fresh ideas. The other thing that helped is that his family had a very particular sense of humor. And if you have a sense of humor, if people are all marching in one direction, you're willing to march in a different direction. So I'll give you an example. There are many stories about Einstein, but many of them are pretend stories. People made it up. But there are a few stories that are real, that are authentic, that we know to be true. And he had a little sister named Maya, who was a few years younger than him. And she kept a journal of what it was like growing up with her big brother, Albert Einstein. It's fascinating. I think you can maybe find it online. And she said when he was little, he was usually nice, but sometimes he'd get angry. And one time when he was about 7 or 8 years old, he got a big, heavy rubber ball and he threw it at her and it hit her in the side of the head. And instead of getting angry, she said, oh, instead of saying, oh, my brother was terrible, when she wrote about it later, you know what she said? She said, that shows you need a really thick head to be the brother of a world famous physicist. And I like that humor. You come in and you take a joke. You see things at a fresh angle. It's a particular. Many people have that, and so that helped Einstein.
I'm not sure if I understand intellectually with the example that you said how why humor is important in his life and why it made him who he is.
Sure. So because he grew up in a sort of humorous family and he liked telling jokes, often if people would often a joke works. You know, you think they're saying about one thing, and you come in with a different a surprise, a punchline, a surprise at the end. So when everybody was trying to work out questions in physics, taking this approach and then the next thing, he would come in from a different angle. He would say, "Oh, what if you looked at it very, very, very differently?" So I can give an example. In E equals mc squared, in that equation, c squared is just a very big number. And E stands for energy, and M stands for mass. And most people think that, so here's a pen, and you think that the pen is made of mass, and energy is things like fire or explosions or the wind coming from my mouth as I speak. And you think they're totally different things. Nobody would think of connecting them. But he found out in his equation that inside this pen, there's a huge amount of energy hidden inside. I can give another example. Suppose you have never seen fire in your life, and I give you a piece of wood, and you've never seen fire, and I light it, and all the smoke starts coming out. You would say, where did that come from? I had no idea. Piece of wood, a tree, could turn into smoke and flame. You'd have no idea. So you have to have a fresh possibility, look at things in a fresh way. And that's what Einstein did. So his equation, E equals mc squared, it says that if you take a mass, the mass of a pen or something, multiply it by a really big number, c squared is just a big number, and that's how much energy comes out. So if I take a piece of paper and I burn it, the energy is like a little bit, it'd be a little fire, and it would go away. But if I take the energy deep inside something on the atomic level, the energy that comes out, Einstein found is so huge. I'm in London now, it would destroy all of London. So he said it's like a miser, somebody who has a lot of gold, but never lets anybody see it. It's hidden inside a case. If you open it up, you see it, but normally it's hidden. So that's it.
And that is the discovery also of the atomic bomb.
Yes.
With this.
Yes. Because the over Hiroshima in Japan in 1945, there was a little bit of uranium, just a little bit, and a tiny bit of that uranium metal was turned into energy, and it's just like a few grams. But the energy that Einstein sadly discovered was hidden inside there was so extreme that when the bomb went off, some of the light hit the moon and bounced back. Incredible power. Nobody knew that it was there.
How do you think Einstein felt? Because he was alive when the Hiroshima bomb
Yes.
Was exploded. How you think he felt at that time when he saw that his creation killed so many people and will have implications in the world for
Totally.
so many
Well, it turns
years.
out we luckily, we actually know because his secretary was a woman named Helen Dukash, and she woke him up. He was sleeping. He was on holiday in the summer of 1945, and she heard about the atomic bomb on the news, and she woke him up and said, "Professor Einstein, this huge new bomb has gone off, and over a city, not over a group of army troops, but over a city with children and women and all that sort of stuff." And he said, if he had known it would be used that way, he said, he wouldn't have lifted a finger. So Einstein was not a pacifist. He believed that if there's a terrible country like Nazi Germany, you have to defend yourself. And he even, I think, was willing to support using the bomb, say, against the German army if it was attacking. But he thought by the summer of 1945, people disagree, but some people said the bomb was so huge that maybe we could have invited representatives of Japan to look at it being exploded over the ocean or over an island, and to show, look, there's this incredible power, rather than drop it without any warning. So people disagree about it. Einstein himself, his ideas were used in the bomb, but he himself, he was too old then to actually work on it. So he knew it was going on, but it was just his ideas from when he was younger.
So he knew the American military was developing this great weapon to use against Germany.
Right. Because they began the work early in World War II. By the time they finished, Germany was no longer in the war.
It's very interesting, this particular thing, because sometimes when there is a war going on, the technology is developed rapidly to
Very
use
fast.
against the other person. Uh, I'm afraid this can happen with the artificial intelligence now.
Totally.
exactly like the atomic bomb, and
Yes.
that's why it might be inevitable to do that, because other countries will develop it if United States will develop it,
Correct. And
and they
there's
will.
people who, you're right, there's people who say exactly that. They say, look, maybe there's a problem with it, but if we don't develop it, our enemies will develop it. I don't know if it's, history never repeats itself, but sometimes you can get lessons from the past. You can get pointers or lessons or insights. And the atomic bomb was really powerful. And a lot of people said, look, if America doesn't build it, Russia will build it. And if America later doesn't build it, maybe, I don't know, China would build it. And so some people said you can never control it. However, as you know, there's all sorts of treaties and regulations and controls because both sides knew how dangerous it could be. So it took a long time, but there are certain controls. Also, there's famous ways of communicating between Washington and Moscow and Washington and Beijing in China, because the generals and the presidents, however angry they are at each other, they don't want an accident. They don't want, it's like in the movies when two people are holding guns at each other. You want to be careful the other guy doesn't make a mistake. So it's not perfect, and we're in a delicate position. There's lots of weapons, but we did manage to control them a little bit. Even these very powerful weapons that you don't want to give up yourself. So maybe AI can be controlled a bit like that. I'm not an expert.
So what are the discoveries? I, I saw your talk at the Royal Institute, and you talked about some other things that we have because of Einstein in real life now. So what are other discoveries that we have, or things in life because of Einstein?
Sure. So some of it is, so in an atomic bomb, you use E equals mc squared very fast. You take a little bit of mass and it explodes out the energy in a fraction of a second. In an atomic energy station, you do it very slowly. You take only a little bit at a moment. So instead of being incredibly hot, hotter than the sun, it's hot, but it's like a furnace that can make water boil or sodium or other things boil. Well, not sodium, and it can make a turbine turn. So one is atomic energy. It has good and bad parts. it can be dangerous, but if it's done carefully, like in France, it can be fairly okay. Again, I'm not an expert, but it's a very powerful thing. Um, I think that's probably one of the biggest results. Another one, which curiously has been, go ahead.
Let me rephrase to make sure this is what a lot of people, for example, I hear a lot of times Elon Musk saying that he's pro nuclear power, energy producing stuff. We don't need to shut them down. We need to create more, but carefully. So
Mhm.
this is what creating energy with this thing. This is what you are referring to, right?
Yes, that's it. So if you put uranium or other materials like that inside these machines and very carefully adjust them, they begin to. Uh, it's a very controlled explosion, sort of like petrol inside your car. If you take a big container of petrol and light it, it's too dangerous. It'd be like a bomb, if you fill a room with petrol. But inside your car, the traditional cars, a tiny bit of petrol is shot in, inside the engine, and the engine goes around, and a bit more is shot in, and it goes around. So you control it, but you have to do it carefully.
Okay. What's some other things that you have?
I suppose another one is that some of those engines that are used to create electricity, if you make them smaller, you can put them inside a submarine. And so we have submarines that have these engines where the fuel is very small. So if you take a traditional engine running on gasoline or something like that, you can't keep a submarine underwater for weeks on end. But the modern nuclear submarines can stay underwater for months because the fuel doesn't get used up. It's get used up only very, very slowly, and you can generate fresh oxygen. You can generate heat. You can generate power. It's very powerful, and so that allows us to keep these terribly dangerous atomic weapons underwater, traveling around, so nobody knows where they are. Like in the movies, if two people are pointing guns at each other, there's always an incentive to shoot first. If two people are pointing, if this one shoots first, the game's over. He wins. And if two people are having nuclear weapons at each other, for example, now, with all the fighting in Ukraine, Putin is talking about he has nuclear weapons. He knows America and France and England have nuclear weapons. And there's kind of like a threat, but nobody is going to use them first. And one reason is because of these nuclear submarines. Suppose America had all its nuclear weapons, say outside of New York, sitting there in the open. If Putin destroyed them first, he would win. It would be a great incentive. But he knows that even if he destroys all the weapons in America, there's submarines deep underwater traveling around the world in the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, and nobody can find them because they don't have to come to the surface for week after week, for month after month. So they hide down there. And someone like Putin, however angry he gets, he knows that he cannot destroy all of America's weapons in one shot. He can't do this. It wouldn't work because there'd be all these other hidden guns coming back. So it's not pleasant, but so far it has worked since the 1950s.
Wow. Wow. I never thought about that. That the person who shoots first has an advantage, but they develop mechanisms to be okay to shoot first and also or shoot second and to have backup plans
Yes, yes,
for war.
it's the backup. It's the backup. That's it.
Okay, so I have so many questions, but I read Einstein's biography, and he was saying that he was staying alone. He had some wife or girlfriend or something like that, and he was choosing to stay alone, to think and to do his work. What do you think about this, and what do you make of this information?
It's a real difficulty. If you, on the one hand, as you know, like suppose you're a musician and you love music, you come alive on the keyboard. It's the best thing. But you also have a wife or a husband and a family, and you want to be decent to them. You want to be with the person you love, you want to take care of your children, but yet you love being on the keyboard. It's the most satisfying thing. You sometimes see musicians, they're happier there than anywhere else. So Einstein had the same thing. By the way, he actually liked playing the piano and the violin. He was good at it, but he loved thinking about science. But he also was a really friendly guy. He liked sitting in a cafe, telling jokes. He was really friendly. So when he was young, he fell in love with a female student at his university, and they got married. They were very bohemian. She was a independent, sort of feminist woman, and at the beginning they got on great. But it was a very sexist time. The moment they started having kids, everybody said the woman will put her career to the side. She'll take care of the children. So they went from being two students who had an identical life. They were fun ideas. They would be bohemian, to suddenly he was the thinker and she had to stay at home. So they began to argue and got resentful. So they ended up getting divorced. He felt sad about that. And sometimes, the phrase on the rebound, boing, a rebound. If you break up with somebody who's an intellectual, you might go with somebody who's artistic. Or if you break up with somebody who's very athletic, you might go for somebody who's not athletic but who's very intellectual. You often jump to the opposite. So Einstein jumped to the opposite of his first wife. He very quickly married a woman named Elsa in Berlin. His first wife was very informal, wasn't interested in looks, just wanted to be intense and like an intellectual. The second wife was from a bit of an actress. She dressed very nicely. She had sophisticated friends. And so Einstein just jumped to that second world. And the thing is, she was a pleasant person. He said to his children, he had two sons from his first wife. He said, she's a nice person. She's not that interesting, but she's a nice person. So when he was married to a second wife, he had a number of affairs. And he was always nice. He never insulted his wife. He kept it private. And he would sometimes go to a house outside of Berlin where he had the affairs. And there was a maid who worked at that house. And she said, oh, the professor was very nice. When he'd have another lady over, there'd be laughing and conversation. It'd be really friendly. So it wasn't like a terrible, dirty thing. It'd be like, a nice, sophisticated person, but it never really lasted. And then after his wife died, when they were both middle-aged, he was living in America then. And he was still friendly, always talked to people, liked having friends, but he felt a bit lonesome. And there's a nice story about how he felt about it. When he was young, his best friend was an Italian engineer named Michela Besso, like Michelangelo. And when Einstein was in his 70s, his friend Michela died. And Einstein wrote to Michela's children, a boy and a girl, and said, you know what I liked about your father? He was a good man. He was a nice man. But what I most admire is he made a relationship with one woman last for his entire life. And Einstein said, that's something that I have failed in twice. So he realized there was a lacking. He wished he could have made affairs were fun for him and nice, but he really wanted one person that could have lasted. So that's one of the things he felt sad about in his life.
So do you think this is one of the regrets maybe that he had in his life? Let's
Yes.
say.
Yes. So I think, he was proud of being a good thinker. I think he liked of his two sons, one of them unfortunately had mental problems and ended up in an institution. But the other one became a really nice professor in America. And Einstein and his older son, they got on very well. They'd go for long walks, and he liked that. He was proud of that. He liked his friends. In the 1930s and 40s, Einstein worked very hard to get refugees out of Europe to safe countries. And he was very good at that. So he was pleased about that. So it's sort of like, in your life, you probably have 4 or 5 things. You have your friends, you have your family, you have your work, what you can do maybe in politics or to help people. You have several things. So Einstein, he was proud of his work. He was proud of his friends. He was proud of his children. And he just felt sad he had never made that one other part of the relationships really work. I think when you get older, you become very philosophical. You can't get as happy or as sad as you can when you're a teenager. When you're a teenager, 17 or 18, you think, this is the most wonderful thing in the world, or this is the most terrible thing. And as Einstein was older, he didn't think his life was a failure or a success. He said it was mixed.
So at one point, he was probably one of the most famous people in the world when he was
Totally.
alive.
Totally.
And still he today he is one of the most famous people ever left the earth. But how do you think he was dealing with that fame? And did he like it? Did he not like it? How he was dealing with it?
So, you're right. Einstein was very famous, and he thought it was silly. He thought uh, he knew he was a good physicist. He wasn't immodest. But there's a lot of good famous physicists, Heisenberg, Niels Bohr. There are a lot of top people, and he happened to get famous because his ideas became famous right after World War One. He had ideas about how outer space works, and so he was German and an English physicist. Right after the war, went to an expedition in Africa, and during an eclipse managed to prove that Einstein's theories were right. And could you imagine, right after this terrible war in Ukraine, suppose that a Russian scientist and a Ukrainian scientist work together and find something beautiful in outer space? People would think, oh, there could be peace. Or suppose there's a war between the US and China, and after it, Chinese scientists and American scientists work together. So I think people thought Einstein, he represented peace. He represented something from outer space that came down to Earth. So you're right, he was very famous. So he thought it was silly. He thought, I'm a good scientist, but there's lots of good scientists. But then he did something very mature. He said, even though it's silly, let me use it for the good. So whenever he had extra money, like I said, he would give it to charity, or he would use it to help refugees, if either get out of Germany or Europe, and also to give them money to help start a new life. Because if you go to a new country, you need language lessons, maybe a first job, money for the first apartment. It reminds me of some of the people who get famous in acting. Many of them become silly. They take drugs or they show off. But some of them say, look, I'm a good actor, but there's other people who are good actors. I just got very lucky. Let me use my money for good causes. Let me use my fame for good causes. Um, and they'll promote, good charities, or they'll use it well. So Einstein was like that. Think of an ordinary person. Think of a friend of yours who's just a nice guy who happens to get incredibly famous.
There is stories in his biography about meeting with a lot of famous physicists, or even like the most famous people back then, like Charlie Chaplin. I'm not sure if I
Yeah, Charlie Chaplin. Yes.
but like how Einstein, the great Einstein, was personally learning in his life. He was using all this stuff to get knowledge and meet with anybody he wanted. Like how he was learning in his life.
Yeah. So sometimes it was just silly. One time he went to America in 1930 to California. And when he got off the boat, you know the word cheerleaders, like at American football games, these girls dress up, say, hooray, hooray, Einstein today. And they're a group of cheerleaders going, hooray, hooray, Einstein today. And he thought, that's silly. But then on that same visit in Los Angeles in 1930, he met Charlie Chaplin, who was actually a very intelligent man, a skilled actor who grew up in England and really thoughtful. And one time they were at an opening of one of Charlie Chaplin's movies, the movie called City Lights. And there were great crowds there with cameras and thousands of people. And Einstein said to Charlie Chaplin, you're even more famous than I am. What does it mean? Why do people do this? And Charlie Chaplin said something which Einstein found very interesting. Charlie Chaplin said, they don't even know. They do this because everybody does this. And that was very relaxing for Einstein to learn.
So, but you didn't answer my question how the great Einstein was learning
Yeah. So
stuff.
when he was young, up until his 40s or maybe even age 50, the fame, sometimes it got in the way, but he learned a little bit because he could meet any political leader. He could meet presidents or prime ministers. But what was even more important, he could travel. So he traveled to Japan in, I think, 1922, and he really liked it. All the doors were open. If he wanted to speak to a Japanese philosopher or a Japanese teacher or get a private tour of the beautiful temples in Kyoto, he could do that. It would be like if, suppose you had a magic power. Anywhere you wanted to travel on Earth, people would be nice to you. So it's like, do you want to see Buckingham Palace and learn what it's like in London? Dunk. You could go inside. They'd like to show you. Do you want to go into a museum in Japan or China? So he's like a tourist. He actually wrote a little diary of what it was like going to Japan, and he really liked that opportunity. But his main learning, the main learning, that was like a tourist. His main learning was he could meet any scientist on the world. So it really helped. He could, sometimes you feel isolated, and he never had to feel isolated. If he wanted to, suppose you get a phone call and you're really busy, say, don't bother me. And somebody says, oh, it's actually Albert Einstein on the phone. Say, for him, I'll take the phone call.
So he was abusing this power for him to learn more and understand the universe better and
Yeah.
experience
And it was
more
also
things.
useful because the people who he spoke with, they benefited. They got to have conversations with Albert Einstein. But really, he spent a lot of time just with his family. He loved just sitting alone with his violin or sitting alone with his piano, just playing and thinking. He spent a lot of time thinking.
So you are Jewish, as you mentioned. What do you think Einstein directly or indirectly did for the Jewish community?
I suppose he did two things. One is on the very specific level, because there were many Jewish people in Europe who had to escape, otherwise they'd be killed in the 1930s and early 1940s. So he helped hundreds of people escape. So that was a nice thing. But I suppose the larger thing he did was just make this group feel good. It'd be sort of like in England sometimes if black people are not terribly persecuted, but there can be people can be sarcastic towards black people or be negative towards them or have negative stereotypes. And there was a famous black news announcer on the BBC, Trevor McDonald, and my black friends in London were really proud. People could look at him, an intelligent man, a man that everybody liked. So if somebody was going to be negative, they could see a positive example. So he was a very attractive role model for many people. When he was an old man, he was old when Israel was created in the late 1940s, and they offered him the presidency of Israel. It was a ceremonial post. The prime minister is the executive post. The president is kind of like being king. It's ceremonial. But he was too old to accept it. So he said, thank you very much, but I'm an old man. By then he really was old. He was in his 60s, and he was almost 60, and he was getting quite ill. But that would have been a ceremonial post.
So how the hell did you learn all these things about Einstein?
You see books behind me. So I just read. There's been biographies of him and interviews and YouTube videos. So I just immersed in that world. I just surrounded it. And people sometimes ask me, say, David, you've been a writer for almost 50 years, 50. I want to be a writer, they say. What should I write about? And the answer is usually very simple: something that you care about. Think of the interviews that you've done. You've interviewed a lot of people, and you'll always be professional. You know how to do it. You're polite. You ask the right questions. But there's some things you really care about, that you really want to know. You're interested. And that's what works with writing. So if you told me, David, I'm going to force you to do research on just some arbitrary thing that I'm not interested in, if you paid me a lot of money, I might do it. Or if you forced me. But if you said, here's an opportunity to do something you really care about, find out what was the wisdom of this man who reminds you of your father. What was the wisdom of this man who understood the universe? What was the wisdom of this man who everybody loves? Why do they love him? So that motivated me from within. It was a nice motivation.
The answer to my question, why and how, it's because you had a lot of internal motivation to figure these things out.
Yes, you really need that, because otherwise it's, well, when people have worked for you, if they really care, if you're making a table, you can make a table out of wood. It's nice. But if you just find it beautiful, you really want to make just a beautiful table to show your friends, you'll work really carefully. You'll make it smooth. Then you'll make it even smoother. You'll want to make it beautiful.
So on that process, where you think you learn most of the stuff? Is it by just watching videos of him to see him like alive and understand his thing, or is it by listening other stuff that other people wrote about him? that of people that they met him? Is it about reading his own stuff? Is it about like uh, doing meditation? You personally, what was the most uh, unexpected way that you actually learned a lot of information that you didn't expect?
I mean, those are great questions because you've described the full range of stuff. So for me, it was very exciting to go to YouTube and see him speaking. Wow, he's actually speaking. There were some books written by people who knew him, people who worked with him, or like I said, there was a journal written by his little sister. And when I opened those up, I loved it. Somebody published his love letters. So when he was 23 and 24, when he was courting that young woman, that student in Switzerland, we find the letters they wrote back and forth. I loved reading those letters. It was so interesting. So I think the documents that came from him, either as an old man, him speaking, or as a young man, the things that he was writing, I found those really interesting because it feels true. You feel it's like you have a chance to be there. Imagine if there was, I don't know, think of a relative you never met, maybe a great grandparent. And suppose you found out when they were young, somebody kept an account of what they were like as a teenager in their 20s. You would love to read it. You'd be so interested. Yeah.
Wow. So I just want to point out before we move to a different, slightly topic, of the importance that you put on the traveling, and that the traveling really was one of the things that made him who he is. Because a lot of times when you connect a lot of different things, or understanding the American culture, understanding the
Yes.
German culture,
Yes.
understanding the European thing, it kind of makes you able to have a greater understanding of the world, and make become clever in a way. So I just wanted to point out and not undermine the thing that you said in the beginning, that I was not able to touch a
Yes,
lot.
that's exactly that's right at the center. And if you think that mix, now it doesn't always give you fresh ideas, but it gives you a good chance. So as I said, I live in London, and there's people here who grew up in almost every
It's all
country.
about life is all about chances. So
Yes, and in a place like London, I think 70 or 75% of the people in London, their parents did not come from London, so they're from all over the world. When I walk down the street, there's people from everywhere. Anyways, I was going to a place. There was a van on the street that was selling chicken, and it had a really interesting flavor. And it turned out the guy who, one of the people who works in the van, is from Mexico, um, but uh, uh, he he had friends from Italy, so they created a mixture of Italian flavor and Mexican flavor, and they made this a wonderful mix. If he was only in Mexico, I love Mexican food. It'd be great. If somebody else was only in Italy, I really like Italian food. It would be great. But because they met here, they come up with something that neither of them would have ever imagined. And it's a really nice mix. A little bit of cumin, a little bit of basil.
and a lot of times a lot of billionaires say, oh, the reason that they became successful because is the intersection of philosophy and engineering, or
Yes,
is because
yes,
of they connected some different topics that they did a unique connection.
totally.
So
And again, islands are any place that's on a trade route is often more interesting. So clearly, Cyprus, the big ports around the Mediterranean, Alexandria, Tel Aviv, some of the ports in Italy and stuff. They get people mixing in from different places, and sometimes it doesn't work. People hate each other, but sometimes it works really well. You get a mix, and people often make jokes about the people who live further away from the mixture. Oh, they're just a farmer. They're never going to change their views. That's not always true. Sometimes quiet reflection can do a lot. But if you're in these mixed cities, you have a good chance.
yes, and that diversity on the gene pool create better results.
So when people marry from different backgrounds, I don't know about the genetics, but just the ideas are interesting. You get ideas from different cultures. Now, the thing is, the same thing can actually happen even in a little village. You can get, like, suppose somebody's from a family that's, I don't know, very conservative or very dogmatic, and they marry somebody from another family that is more into telling jokes and stuff. Both of them have their advantages. There's times to tell jokes. There's time to be very firm and hard. And if two people from different backgrounds mix, it's great. There's more things you can do. Sometimes you can tell jokes. Sometimes you can be, very firm and dogmatic. So you have more things you can pull from.
So now I want to ask about why Einstein sucked at his later point of his life that you are mentioning. You don't say that he sucked, but but like he was not as innovative. Like he didn't understood quantum mechanics,
Yeah.
and so and that's why you wrote one whole book about that. So
Yeah. It's actually sad. When he was successful, he did things like all of us, but better than we can do. And when he was unsuccessful, he did things like all of us, but often worse than we do. An extreme person, they often take it to extremes. Um, so think of like a rock star, a musician. They can have incredibly powerful emotions and speak to us, really communicate, or they can be like just really silly and babyish and take drugs and be like a baby breaking a hotel room. So they can go to the fluctuations, the changes are big. So as you know, many people, when they get older, they get stuck in their ways. They say, when I was young, I did it this way, and there's no reason to change it. You see it in technology very often. Um, the head of Microsoft after Bill Gates was a man named Steve Ballmer, and Microsoft a long time ago. Now it's successful, but at the time of Bill Gates, it was very successful. It had almost a monopoly on Windows and stuff. And so when the first iPhone came in, created by Apple, Steve Ballmer, who was the head of Microsoft, said, "It's stupid. Puh, it'll never take off. Nobody needs an iPhone. It doesn't even have a keyboard you can press. You can't receive facsimile messages or faxes on it." So he was able to do that because when he was younger at Microsoft, nobody had an iPhone. He got stuck in his way. And because he was very rich and was the chief executive officer, nobody questioned him. So you said about Einstein, and the same thing happened. Because he was so famous by the time he was 40 and 50, he said when new ideas in science came up, quantum mechanics, how things bounce around and change, he was suspicious. And he said, well, you know what? I was very successful before. I had a different view before and was very successful. Not just a little successful. I was Einstein. I was the most famous person on earth. If I believe that these new ideas are wrong, they must be wrong. And in fact, he was just an old person stuck in his ways. So sometimes it helps not to be too successful.
so you think it's a problem of ego mostly?
Ego really gets in the way. And even if you're not trying to be terrible or selfish, even if you're trying to be very helpful, um, I can give, there's an example I can give. There's a family that I knew that was very poor when they were younger, and they became more middle class later. And when a child in that family had a 14th birthday, the parents gave the child clean white socks, that you put on your feet. And the kids didn't like that. They wanted, I don't know, Xboxes or fancy shirts or scarves, not clean white socks. And the reason the clean white socks meant so much is the parents had been very poor. And when they were poor, they didn't have enough money for clean, dry socks. Their feet were wet. They had really bad shoes. And so for them, it was a wonderful gift. They were actually trying to be helpful and friendly. But the kids in the next generation didn't like it. Suppose somebody goes, they travel to a big city, and the kid wants to become a painter. And the parent says, don't be a painter. It's terrible. It'll ruin your life. Get a job in the civil service with a guaranteed salary. And now the parent might say that. They're not trying to be mean. They're trying to be helpful. From their generation, perhaps, a job with a solid salary was great. They know what it's like if people have kids, they reach 30, they reach 40, they don't have a solid guaranteed salary. It's terrible. So the child might feel, my father won't let me become an artist, won't let me even try. And the father is saying, look, I'm not trying to be cruel. I know what it's like. This is I'm giving you a good advice. Now, the thing is, often that's right, but the good advice might be, don't go into computers. I don't know what computers are. They're brand new. Well, in fact, as we know, becoming a computer engineer is usually a good job. Same thing with Einstein. When he was young, he'd been so good in a particular approach. He thought, look, I'm not being narrow minded to try to stick to this for the whole rest of my life. It's a good approach. Everybody else must be wrong. But in fact, he just got old, like all of us.
How do you think we can keep this spirit and not let ego get in the way? You personally.
It's very hard. Some of it is by reading and buying my books, because then you can see the problem. You can see even Einstein made this mistake. So what I try to do the following thing, and I sometimes tell my friends, if there's an idea that's very comforting for you, that feels very familiar and comforting, you should be especially suspicious of that idea. Not always. It might, you as you get older, you have good judgment. But if you find it really beautiful and comforting, that should be a sign that you might be an old person stuck in your way. So I try to use that as a little thing to sometimes help. I don't know if I always succeed, but I try that a bit.
What? So basically, you think mostly in his scientific career, he stopped being innovative and all this stuff. And on his political life and on the other parts of his life, probably it didn't have this effect.
Right. So politics is I think you're right about the distinction. And I think it was important because science changes very quickly. Politics changes. Sometimes it changes fast. I think right now, the world is in a place of flux. Politics is changing, as we can see it. In some countries, it's changing very quickly. But often, um, certain attitudes take longer. It's like a big, slow wave in the ocean. So his underlying politics was help people in a practical way. And that's a good, simple principle in politics. He would identify with people who are being hurt. He was no communist. He was against the extremes, but he'd say, let's see if we can help them a little bit. Let's take this sort of sensible middle way. And that lasts fairly long. But in science, ideas change quickly. I can give an example. I'm wearing a white shirt. Turns out 50 or 60 years ago, people could wear a white shirt. 30 years ago, people could wear a white shirt. I'm sure that 20 years from now, people can wear a white shirt. Now, there's many other styles which are much more stylish. Hippies in the 1960s would wear great colors. People, I don't know, might wear purple shirts in the 1980s. But there's certain simple things that you don't have to change very often. So science, unfortunately, is not one of those things. So fashion changes maybe every 6 months or year. Political ideals or moral ideas, some of them like the Bible, can be the same for thousands of years. Science is in between. You have to be able to change your mind every maybe 5 years or 10 years. Just take in new approaches.
So you think he lacked this quality or understanding of the fundamental thing that science is nothing but just a theory improving, or is nothing but just uh, is wrong, not is always wrong in a way, and there is always a great discovery that that proves that the previous discovery was wrong. So you think he believed that science is fixated, is something that okay, this is that's it and it stops there.
He believed that you could always advance in science, but you had to use a certain approach. And his approach was, if something happens, it has a cause, it pushes something else to make something else happen. There's a cause and there's an effect. And he thought that would always be the case. I would think of somebody building a city, and for hundreds of years, you put pieces of brick, you put something sticky under the brick, and you put the brick down, then you put sticky, and you put another brick on top. And then later, somebody tells you there's a totally different way to build a city. You still want to build a city, but they say you can build it with pieces of metal and use a very hot flame and melt a bit of the metal and squeeze it together. So instead of bricks with something sticky, you use a different approach. Suppose I'm really good at bricks and I've seen beautiful buildings out of bricks, buildings in Rome and magnificent things. I don't want to change it. I say, look, this is better than any new approach. So I believe that, yes, we have to continue constructing the building, but I don't want to change the approach at which I make it. So that's what Einstein was like.
I saw that you wrote a book about is you need to be asshole to be successful.
Right. So with a question mark at the end. The book was called The Art of Fairness, The Art of Fairness. And it's about the question, can you succeed without being a terrible person? It's a great question because we know that, at Sunday school, they say you have to be a nice person. But we know that in real life, there's terrible people succeed, people who lie and cheat and steal. They often rise up to the top. And we also know that people who are very soft and polite, really sweet and innocent, people take advantage of them. It doesn't work. So being terrible, definitely it can succeed. And being too soft and too polite, there's a phrase, nice guys finish last. That doesn't work. But the big question, is there a path in between? Is there a way to succeed in something really hard like business or politics or surgery or the army where you're not terribly mean, but you're not soft? Is there a way in between? And I was really interested in that. So I'm no expert. I'm just a writer. So I spent a long time interviewing people, visiting different organizations in the army, in hospitals, in law companies, in law firms, in business. And I found about 6 or 7 people who succeeded, who found that path in between. So I really loved that book, The Art of Fairness. It came out about 3 years ago. And I love the stories that it's hard, but you can succeed without being a total jerk, but it's hard.
But a lot of times you are misunderstood when you are in those positions. Like being jerk can be something that your employees think because they don't understand the data that you understand as a business leader. Like, for
Totally.
example, Elon Musk, he needed to fire like whatever 8,000 people more, I don't know, on Twitter, but because he saw that the organization was going to the ground, so he needed to make some changes. So everyone thinks that he's an asshole because of that, and he's a jerk. That how do you dare to fire so many people at once? But so, what do you think about this point? That maybe after all, the people that we think they are jerks, they are not jerks, but they are just I don't know. Yeah. So, what's
Doing
your
what's
comment?
necessary. You could say they.
Yeah.
So I
Yes.
actually agree with you. I think there's times when you have to be very firm, and there's a great example. Suppose suppose you work at a hospital, and there's a doctor who yells at you, "Get out of the way." You might think that's really rude, but suppose he's pushing somebody who has an emergency, and it's okay for him to say, "Get out of the way." So at first you're offended, but if you realize why he's doing it, you would say, you know what? I understand. So sometimes in a company, sometimes people fire people for no good reason. They're very insulting about it. They humiliate them. Sometimes they say, look, the company's losing money. We have 100 people. We have to fire 40 people. That's the only way to keep the other 60 going. I'm sorry. If we have the money, we'll give you a bit of a payoff. We'll write nice letters of recommendation so you can get other jobs. But we have to do this. So I would call that the intermediate path. If somebody fires for no reason, like, I want you to see I'm very macho, I'll show what I can do, that's obnoxious. And if somebody never fires and the company goes bust, that's no good. That's too soft and too polite. But in between, there's a phrase, to be firm but fair. And the way to find out if it's fair is, so I've been fired from some jobs. And if later, at the moment, nobody likes it. But later, if you learn about it and think, you know what, if it was reversed, I would have done the same thing. If you think if it was reversed, if you have time to think about it, then it's okay. So it's like, how do you avoid those extremes? And if you get the reputation for being fair that way, then people like to work with you.
I give you $1 trillion. How do you use it to have impact in this beautiful world?
I think the first thing I would do is buy more bookshelves. I have books stacked everywhere. I need more bookshelves, but I would not buy $1 trillion worth of bookshelves. I think what I would try to do is see at the point where you can have the greatest effect. So if there's a rich person who's going to university, or even a poor person who goes to a top university, that's great, but they don't need my help. But if you have somebody who's from a poor background and is just on the edge, can they go to a technical college? Maybe, maybe not. They need a few $1,000s and it would make all the difference in their life. That's a great person to target. And so I think there's some charities that do it really well. They target just where it makes an enormous difference. So if you work on
But
medicine,
you are not telling me what areas and how. This
oh,
is what
so
I.
yeah. So I think one of my main areas would be education, trying specifically to look at people from fairly poor backgrounds who have a little bit of energy and help fund the schools. They can be either online with Zoom or they can be physical schools that can just make a difference. So all through Africa and South America, there's a lot of people who want to be nurses. They don't have the education or time to be doctors, but there's a lot of people who want to be nurses. I've traveled a fair bit. There's a lot of people, boys and girls, mostly boys, but a lot of girls who want to be software engineers. But to train 1 million software engineers, it was going to cost $10,000 each. That's $10 billion right there, just to train 1 million software engineers. But it would make the world a better place. All these people would have jobs. They could even be in refugee camps. You can do it online. So I would try to focus it on education just at the level usually of young adults. The other level, if there was money left over in the $1 trillion, is older people who've either through chance or mistakes or whatever are in a difficult position, especially when people are having smaller and smaller families these days. Nobody deserves to die in a really unhappy way. And for older people, a small,
Alone in a room without any friends.
correct, and a small investment can make a world of difference, a world of difference. And again, if you spread it among a lot of people, the world's population is really big. It's about 8 billion people. So $8 trillion is $1,000 a person. $1 trillion is, maybe $120 a person. And admittedly, not everybody needs it. But if you focus it, say old people really can change a lot of suffering. Young people who are trying to make that transition, you can really focus it in well. So those two things, plus bookshelves for David Bodanis, the mixture of that would make me very happy.
So, as a last question, because we left it, I asked you. We said that we're going to touch on it. How much money did you made by your books? Like, is it a job that people can do for a living? Like, it's like.
Oh, so the books really vary. Somebody like J.K. Rowling, who wrote Harry Potter, she can spend her whole life after her success not working. My books, sometimes they do well, sometimes they do poorly. So it's nice always to have another thing you can do that you like. A friend of mine wasn't a writer, but this ties in. She was a dancer. She's a really good dancer. But it's hard to earn a lot of money as dancing. You can be on the musical theater, the stage in London, for like 6 months and earn a nice salary, but you might not have a job for another year. So she became an accountant also, just working over the books and numbers. And it's really useful. Everybody needs a good accountant. It's very useful. So for 1 day a week, she would work as being an accountant. And if she really needed it, she would do it like for a week or 2 weeks. And maybe with a charity, with a company, and enjoyed it. But it paid well. And it allowed her to do this other thing. So there were some times in her life when the dancing worked really well and she could live entirely on the dancing. But at other times, she had this also just in case. So for anybody who wants to be a writer, I recommend that.
And not be stressed. But so let's say can you give me an example of your book of Einstein that we talked? How much money it generated in total, or this is
The details I never talk about, but so some of them, you can spend a while. You can go straight to your next book, which is nice. Others, if they don't sell that well, don't get depressed about it. Some people enjoyed it. Hopefully, you enjoyed it, and you can do some other work on the side.
how many books you wrote in total?
I think about maybe 10 or 11. I can't. I
Okay.
can't remember exactly.
And we put all of them in the description below for people to go and purchase them.
Right.
And I want to say, I love you. Thank you for your time. And you teach me so much. And I have a better understanding living this conversation about Einstein's life.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. Till later.